his wings of love all thine. God will take care of you. God will take care of you through every day, for all the way. He will take care of you. God will take care of you. No matter what may be the test, God will take care of you. Lean weary one upon his breast, God will take care of you. God will take care of you through every day, for all the way. He will take care of you. God will take care of you. We have the privilege today of having Dean Miller coming up from Tennessee at the present time to be with us with a program on love, life, and loss, or widowhood. He's been working on this for a while, has made several presentations in various states east of the Mississippi, and I think he's going to be venturing out west of the Mississippi here in the near future. And appreciate Dean being able to be here for us today. Dean Miller.
Doyle, I was really impressed with how comfortable you are with old school. You said we were going to go old school. So I don't know what that says about you, but I noticed you were real comfortable with the old school way of doing things. Boy, I'm really so thankful that you're here this morning. I know that giving up any time in our lives is more and more becoming a challenge. Life's very hectic. We're involved in a lot of things, and we have, it seems like, very little time. What we have to do sometimes is make time, not take time, but make time to do things that are really important. And I just appreciate the fact that though you could have been somewhere else this morning and you could be doing something else this morning, you've chosen to be here, and I just am really thankful for that. You know, I really don't think that in regard to these workshops that I do, that the numbers are really that important. I've done these workshops for groups as small as 6 and as large as 400. To me, what's most important is the degree of interest, not the number who are there. And I just really appreciate the fact that you have the kind of interest that you were willing to take time or make time in your life to be here. It's an encouragement to me to see people who are interested in thinking about and talking about this subject, which is really not a very well-attended subject. It's just something that we just, I don't think, have talked much about. Well, of course, before you become widowed, you've got to get married. And if you're a smart fella, which I wasn't, you got to make sure you remember the anniversaries. And there are some anniversaries that if you forget, you're in big trouble. And I heard about this fella who forgot about him and his wife's silver anniversary. Now, for those of you from Ohio, silver, that means 25, if that'll help you out. But anyway, he forgot his 25th anniversary, and his wife was mad. I mean, she was really mad at him. And she just was ripping him up one side and down the other that evening and said, look, I've given a quarter century of my life to you and to this relationship. You have missed our 25th anniversary. Tomorrow, when I get up in the morning and I look out in the driveway, there better be something red out there that can go from 0 to 200 in 60 seconds. Well, of course, that put a lot of heat on him. So he went to bed that night, but he made sure he took care of his responsibility before he went to bed. His wife got up, looked out the upstairs window down to the driveway, and sure enough, there was something red out there in the driveway. It was a box, a red box with a white bow. So she went down, surely thinking that when she opened that box, there was going to be a set of keys there to a beautiful red car that could go really fast. Well, she went down and she opened that red box, and what was inside was a red set of bathroom scales that could go from 0 to 200 in 3 seconds. And Bob has not been seen since. Living together in a married relationship is sometimes a challenge, but there's a lot of fun to it, and there's a lot of joy, and there's a lot of richness in life when we enjoy another person in that very special relationship. But when we lose that person, that's a big challenge. So I want to share with you some things this morning that are of an introductory nature. And then what I'd like to do after I just kind of introduce the subject a little bit, I want to share with you what I call the divine perspective in regard to widowhood. My wife was born September 22nd, 1952, and just like all other babies, she was a beautiful baby. I didn't know her back then, but I had the opportunity to meet her when I was 15 years old. My father, when he left home down in the Huntington, West Virginia area when he was a kid, when he left home, he left the Lord, he left the church, and he left West Virginia and crossed the river to Ironton. And there's where he found my mom. Well, what happened was during the first 15 years of my life, I grew up in a family that was not a Christian family. I never went to church. But when my father moved us all to New Philadelphia, Ohio, which is about 25 miles south of Canton, Ohio, in northeast Ohio, he decided that he was going to come back to the church, and we were going to be a church-going family. Now, you got to remember, I was a 15-year-old kid, and by then, I'd become pretty heathen at that point. But I gave a concession to my father and did not create a real problem, and so I started for the first time going to church when I was 15 years old. I found this young lady there named Ruth Ann, and I was way more interested in her than the Lord when I started going to church there. But I really did absorb a lot initially. The church there was very welcoming to our family. My father was restored to the Lord. My mother became a Christian. And about 6 months after I started going to church there, I became a Christian. My wife, the lady who became my wife, had already become a Christian years earlier because she was raised in a Christian family. And she became a Christian when she was about 12 or 13 years old. But that's where we met. And we got married. And we got married at a not so wise time in life. I had just finished my first year as a freshman at Freed-Hardeman College at the time. And I couldn't live without her, and we were 750 miles away from one another. So we got hitched just a few days before I was to start my sophomore year in college. And we left there and we moved down to Chester County, Tennessee, and moved into Henderson. And there we stayed for a few years while I finished up my schooling before we moved back to Ohio. Well, we enjoyed 41 years of marriage together, and we had what I thought was an awfully good relationship. We had 3 daughters born to that relationship, and they are spectacular young ladies. I'm very proud of the fact that they're all faithful members of the Lord's church. The one is a very faithful member of the Laverne Church of Christ. She lives in Smyrna, Tennessee, between Nashville and Murfreesboro. She is a corporate accountant for Bridgestone Firestone in Nashville. And then I have my youngest daughter who lives outside of Atlanta, and she's about 30 miles west of Atlanta. Her husband is a deacon in the Lord's church at Villa Rica, Georgia, and she's the church secretary there. And they yesterday had 6 inches of snow. And my grandkids are loving sliding down a hill. Now, you got to remember, they don't have sleds in Atlanta, but they do have clothes baskets, and that's all you need. And so my grandkids yesterday just climbed in a clothes basket and slid down the hill, and they had a ball. Thank the Lord for whoever invented these great phones where we can have videos sent to us from hundreds of miles away. And then I have a daughter in Gainesville, Florida, who is married to a deacon, and they are members of the University City Church in Gainesville, Florida. And I'm just so thankful for their faithfulness to the Lord and for their good hearts. And they really, along with me, are the ones that birthed this widowhood workshop ministry. For the first 3 years, we were the sole supporters of this ministry, and I could not have begun this and started this, launched this in the early months, in the early years, without their assistance in many ways. We had 5 grandchildren that were born to our married relationship. This picture was taken about 15 months after my wife passed away at the place where my wife is buried. And I have 3 children outside of Atlanta, and grandchildren outside of Atlanta, and I have 2 grandchildren down in Gainesville, Florida. My wife loved her grandchildren, and she loved Christmas. She, as a matter of fact, got the nickname Nana Claus because she did Christmas up really big. When she was in bed and not even able to move her arms because she had Parkinson's disease, and imagine what it's like to lay in a hospital bed in your home and have a baby, a child, a small child put into your bed and not be able to wrap your arms around that child. The last time that the grandkids saw their Nana was Thanksgiving 2013. My wife was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, and she only lasted 8.5 years, which is a very short period of time for a Parkinson's patient. It's not uncommon for a Parkinson's patient to live 20 years past or even 30 years past their diagnosis, but it is a continual challenge because the best that a Parkinson's patient can hope for is what you might call a plateau, because there's just going to be an inevitable deterioration. And that's what she experienced in a quick pace over 8.5 years. On Christmas of 2013, it was the Christmas where the kids, the 2 daughters who are married, were with the in-laws. One was up outside of Washington, D.C., and one was in the panhandle of Florida. One was with me, had come home with me, and my oldest daughter from Middle Tennessee. And at 9:40 on Christmas morning of 2013, with my daughter on her left and me on her right, we watched her breathe her last breath. And that's how this journey started that created the Widowhood Workshop Ministry. Because what I found by experience, which is a lot of times a lot better teacher than something from a book or even from ministering to other people. I found out what a struggle this was. And I came to realize that in the Lord's church especially, we had not really done much in the way of addressing the challenges of widowhood. And a month after my wife passed away, after doing some research, trying to find widowhood ministries in the Lord's church or widowhood ministries anywhere, I found little to nothing. And I said to myself, somebody ought to do something. I convinced myself that what we really had been missing through my experience was we haven't done much in the way of addressing caregiving and supporting and encouraging and helping and even training people to be good caregivers and to be supported as caregivers. And we also had neglected the area of widowhood and helping people with those challenges and preparing them for that experience. And that was really what caused me to decide to start doing a lot of reading about this subject and start researching this subject and finding out as much as I possibly could and see if there was some way that I could develop something that could be a ministry to raise awareness about widowhood, to help educate people who've never been widowed, to help be a blessing to those who are widowed, and then to help local churches maybe start local widowhood ministries that could be a real blessing to them. And what I have been I just keep on telling people is, especially when it comes to widowhood, don't waste your pain. You've been through this agonizing experience, and maybe you're still going through an agonizing, difficult time in your life. It'd be a shame to waste your pain. You know, no matter what pain that you've experienced in your life, you can use that pain to the glory of God and for the benefit of others. If you'll open up and if you'll take opportunities or make opportunities in your life to share your story and to share what you've learned personally, you can be a real glory to God and a blessing to others. And that's really what I've been trying to do, and that's what I've been trying to encourage other widowed folks to do. And so that's why I started doing these widowhood workshops. I can tell you the reason why it snowed. It has nothing to do with a meteorological thing. It snowed because this is the 13th workshop that I've done. Now, I knew something was going to happen on the 13th. Either my plane wasn't going to work or something was going to happen, and the white stuff is the reason the reason it happened was the 13th workshop. I've done these workshops in West Virginia, Florida, and in Tennessee, and looking forward to going to a number of other places in 2018. So let me share with you some things generally about widowhood that you might find interesting. I find this subject fascinating. Now, obviously, I am inclined to have an interest in this subject because I are one. And when you are one of something, you have a natural interest to learn more about it. And here are some things that I've learned. Being widowed puts you in a minority. 6%, generally speaking, 6% of the population is widowed in the United States and in most Western cultures. Only 6%. So you have to recognize the fact that you are a minority. Now, here's some really interesting things. Over 750,000 to 1 million every year enter into widowhood just in our country, solely in our country. In 2009, there was a bumper crop of us. Imagine just shy of 500,000 men that year went into widowhood, and almost 1 million women became widowed in that year. So this is something of significance. It is demographically an area of our population that we really shouldn't ignore, because you have probably noticed, haven't you, that 1 out of 1 dies. You know, that's the way it is. Nobody gets out of this world alive, right? Well, if you're married, what's the likelihood of both of you dying at the same time? Not very likely. So we need to think about this subject because it's pretty inevitable. Now, there is a reason why almost everything you read is heavily weighted toward the women. Most research on widowhood has focused on women. Widows outnumber widowers nearly 5 to 1. It's estimated that half of all marriages end with the death of the husband. 1/5 end with the death of the wife. So there are many, many more widows than there are widowers. In our experience during the past 3+ years, that's been the case in every congregation. When my wife passed away, I became the 16th person in that congregation that was widowed. There were 12 women, and I was the 4th man, so there were 16. And I've also noticed, and I shared this with the group that was here last evening, I've also noticed that in every congregation I've been to, if you look at their Sunday morning attendance number, you can probably count on 10% of that number being widowed in that church. The University City Church in Gainesville, Florida, a church of about 350, 360, they have 41 widows. The church in Streetsboro, Ohio, a church of about 90, they have 11 widows and widowers. It's pretty typical in the Lord's church for there to be about 10% that are widowed. And then I got to thinking globally. I found this information about how many widowed folks there are in the United States, and then I started looking at information globally. China has the most widowed people of all countries. They have over 43 million widows in India, over 43 million. China and India together have over 80 million widowed folks, widows, just widows, female widowed people, over 80 million. There is an interesting story in the display I have over there. There is an article in a National Geographic magazine publication from February of this year that is a heartbreaking story telling about what it's like to be widowed in India, which has caused me to wonder about the ministries that we have in the Brotherhood, where we have missionaries in India. What are we doing to minister to those widowed, those females who are widowed in India? There's about 7 million in Japan. But in every country, there are millions of widowed folks. In our country, there are about 15 million, and about 12 to 13 million are females, and about 3 million, or maybe a little over 3 million men who are widowed. So when we have a local widowhood ministry that starts, and so far we've started one in Crockett County, Tennessee, where I am, in Murray City in West Tennessee. I jokingly tell people I'm 80 miles northeast of Graceland. That's where I'm at. And we started one there. We have one started in Nashville, Tennessee. We are now starting one in Stantonville, Tennessee, which is in West Tennessee, very near the Mississippi border. And I am willing to go anywhere and help any congregation start a local ongoing widowhood ministry. But one of the things that you have to count on in those situations is it's going to be heavily weighted and maybe even exclusively weighted to the females. The last widowhood ministry event that we had together at Murray City, Tennessee, we started with 13 22 months ago. We started with 13. Last month we had 45. I was the only man in that number of 45. The most men we've ever had at one time at any of those events was about 4 or 5. But any of these ministries are going to be heavily weighted toward the female, but that's okay because obviously there's a need to help them. But we have to realize that it's just going to be natural, that it's going to be much more inclined to be women than men. Let me share with you a couple of, I think, shocking statistics. Imagine if you were to guess what is the average age of a married female who becomes widowed. What would you guess? Just think about that. What would you guess was the average? I'm not talking about the median. I'm talking about the average age of a married woman when she's widowed in our country. It's 57. It's 57. Now imagine how many young widows you'd have to get that number down to 57. You know, to some of us, I can kind of tell looking around, to some of us 57 is pretty young, isn't it? To imagine 57. Three-fourths of all married women can count on being widowed. Now, obviously, this is a subject we shouldn't ignore, given those statistics. If you look at the population in our country, this is in our country, and you look at the age 55 and older group, 32% of the women in that group, 55 and older, are widowed. If you move that number up to 65 years old, if you look at our country, all the 65-year-olds, 37% of the women, 65 years and older, 37% are widowed. Obviously, there are a lot more people widowed than we maybe think. One of the amazing things to me is my ignorance. And one of the most humbling things about getting older is not the malfunctioning or the lack of function of the human body. It's more how impressed I am every day with my ignorance, things I don't know that I'm coming to learn. And even in regard to widowhood, there's much more that I don't know than I do know. I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination. But it just amazes me when you start working with widowed folks, how much you can learn. How much you can learn about life in general and about loss and about surviving the loss and even learning in light of the loss. If you're born into this world, we live in a fallen world where things get messed up and bad things happen to really good people, and we wonder why, and we agonize about how in the world I'm possibly going to survive this. Well, we live in a fallen world, and there's bad things that are going to happen. If you live in this world, you're going to become attached to things, and you're going to become attached to people. Because of the nature of this world, everything's temporary. So during life, what's going to happen is you're going to experience losses. It could be the loss of a dream job. It could be the loss of your home. It could be the loss of your health. It could be the loss of your mate. That's why when you look at this subject of widowhood, I think it's good to kind of take a step back and take a panoramic look and look at it from the standpoint of life, love, and what's going to follow that is loss, because that's what's going to happen, because things in this world are temporary. So in light of all that, what I've done, or at least what I've tried to do, is develop this ministry to provide some education. By the way, there are 245 million women in this world who are widowed. This is a study from the United Nations that was coordinated by the wife of the Prime Minister of the UK. And they found there were 245 million women who are widowed. 115 million of them live in what is described as devastating poverty. Obviously, we need to do some serious ministering, not just in our country, but worldwide. I was driving in Jackson, Tennessee one day, and I was listening to the radio, and there was this denominational preacher who was preaching. And he, in the course of this lesson he had on the radio, he gave a definition of wisdom that I'd never heard before. You know, I'd always thought about wisdom the normal way we define it. You know, that's using your knowledge effectively and knowing how to use your knowledge effectively. Well, this fella who was this denominational preacher, he said, wisdom is seeing things the way God sees them. I'd never heard that before. Wisdom is seeing something like God sees it. When we have God's perspective about money management, then we've got a wise perspective. When we have God's perspective about marriage, we've got the wise, right perspective about marriage. When we understand God's perspective about widowhood, then we've got the wise, the right perspective about widowhood. And God describes himself as a defender of the widowed, a reliever of the widowed, and a protector of the widowed. Now, in an open forum atmosphere, what does that tell you about God and the widowed? Anybody? Okay, he cares for them. He cares for them. How much does he care for them? Obviously, he cares for them. How much does he care for them? Just looking at those facts.
Enough to defend them.
Okay.
To relieve them and to protect
Enough to get involved. Enough to get in to do something. You know, it's so easy to say we care about whatever. It's another thing to show it. You know, a number of years ago, there was this movie, Show Me the Money was the key mantra of that movie. Well, show me the care. Show me the love. Show me the concern. God does that in every respect. Everybody that he loves, he does what is right and what is best for them. And when it comes to the widowed, obviously God cares. And he cares so much that he provides a watch care and an active providence to help them. Again, think about that. Defender, reliever, protector. There are other passages as well we won't take the time to look at. Psalm 94 and verse 6 talks about how that the wicked slay the widowed. See, wicked people don't care about the widowed. Don't show any care or concern about the widowed. Job 22 and verse 9 is an interesting passage. You know, here you've got Job. He's lost everything in his life. And imagine losing, not just a child, imagine losing 10 children. And all of your riches, and the support of your wife. Then you've got these 3 wonderful friends who take time, who make time in their life to come. And they sit with you in silence for 7 days and they say nothing. By the way, it would have been a miracle if it would have been 3 female friends and they sat there and said nothing. But it was men, so they could go 7 days without saying anything. But then they opened their mouth. And they ripped Job. And they just indicted him because they knew he was suffering because he had done something really terrible in his life. And he needed to fess up. He needed to wrap his brain around the life that he had been living. He needed to wrap his heart around that fact, and he needed to confess the sin in his life that obviously was evidenced by the suffering he'd done in his life. They believed in the theory of retribution, that the reason that you suffer is you sin. And the more you sin, the more you suffer. So Job had to have been a terrible, terrible sinner. That's the only conclusion they could have drawn. Well, one of the things that they said that he had done was he had sent away the widowed. And he sent them away empty. Job, isn't it interesting that from their perspective, that ancient perspective of theirs, for somebody not to care for the widowed, they knew that was wrong. They knew that was sinful. In Deuteronomy chapter 24, there's an interesting passage where before the Israelites are able to go into the land of Canaan, they are reminded about a bunch of things to refresh their minds in the book of Deuteronomy about things that they needed to keep in mind as they made this transition. And one of the things that's mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 24 is the fact that they needed to make sure that they showed concern for people less fortunate than they were. In Deuteronomy chapter 24, look at this passage here beginning at verse 17. I'll read it for those who may not have a Bible handy. You shall not pervert justice, do the stranger or the fatherless, nor take a widow's garment as a pledge. You don't take a widow's garment as a pledge. But you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore I command you to do this thing. When you reap your harvest in your field, and forgot a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat your olive trees, you shall not go over the boughs again. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, the widow. When you gather the grapes out of your vineyard, you shall not glean it afterward. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. And you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore I command you to do this thing. Of all the things that he could have talked to them about, he selects certain things to mention in the book of Deuteronomy, which is, Deuteronomy literally is the second law. It's not like a second different law. It's the reading of the law a second time to familiarize them and remind them about what they'd already been taught. And isn't it interesting that he makes sure that he includes references to caring for people who are less fortunate, and oftentimes they are lumped together people of somewhat like life circumstances. Like, for instance, in this passage, you've got the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. Oftentimes, those three are linked together in Scripture. Or sometimes you'll see two of the three linked together in Scripture. They were less fortunate. They needed some help. They needed to make sure that they didn't neglect these people, because these people, the Israelites, were the people of God. They needed to reflect the glory of God and the nature of God in their lives individually and in their nation. So he says, you make sure at harvest time that you don't forget about these less fortunate people. Widowed people, especially in this ancient culture, they were in a very difficult situation. When you have got, this was a pre-currency economy, I think is a good way to describe it, where a lot of the exchange in the economy had to do with bartering. Well, if you didn't have land and you couldn't produce a crop, or you didn't have critters that you could raise to use in your bartering, you were kind of up a creek without a paddle. And then you've got the inheritance back then always going through the male side. So you have these widowed people, these widowed females, who could be in destitute circumstances because of those kinds of situations. And so God wanted to make sure that those people in those difficult situations were not ignored and they were cared for. Now take a look at this passage in Isaiah chapter 1. This is, I think, one of the most strongly worded passages that I think you'll see in all the Old Testament. In Isaiah chapter 1, God sends the prophet Isaiah to his people, to the people of God. But they weren't acting like they were the people of God. As a matter of fact, they were described in Isaiah chapter 1 in verse 10 as Sodom and Gomorrah. They may have been in covenant relationship with God, but they were acting like heathens. And God was extremely upset with them. And if you just take a look at Isaiah chapter 1 here and look at some of these statements that God makes. In verse 12, for instance, when you come to appear before me, who's required this at your hand to trample my courts? Bring no more futile sacrifices. Incense is an abomination to me. The new moons and the Sabbaths and the calling of assemblies. I cannot endure iniquity and the sacred meeting. Your new moons and your appointed feast my soul hates. They are a trouble to me. I am weary of bearing them. You spread out your hands, and I will hide my eyes from you. Even though you make many prayers, I will not hear. Your hands are full of blood. See what God is having Isaiah do? Isaiah is ripping these people. Here they were claiming to be the people of God. And they were going to church. They were doing church. And they were singing and they were praying. Well, in their case, they were offering sacrifice. They were observing the festivals and the new moons. And their lives were not consistent with their worship. And God sends Isaiah to them and says, look, you have filled the cup of my wrath. I'm sick and tired of what you're doing because your life isn't consistent with your worship. So he says in verse 16, wash yourselves, make yourselves clean. Put away the evil of your doings from before me. Cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice, rebuke the oppressor, defend the fatherless. Watch, plead for the widow. See, one of the things that they were ignoring was their responsibility to be compassionately ministering to the widowed. And so he tells them, plead for the widow. Drop down to verse 21. How the faithful city has become a harlot, and it was full of justice. Righteousness lodged in it, but now murderers. Your silver has become dross, your wine mixed with water. Your princes are rebellious and companions of thieves. Everyone loves bribes and follows after rewards. They do not defend the fatherless, nor does the cause of the widow come before them. Of all the things that he could have said that were wicked, obvious indications that they were wicked, yet claiming to be holy and seeking him in their rituals, among the things that they had failed to do was minister to the widowed. In the New Testament, Jesus talks about the scribes and the Pharisees and how that they would devour widows' houses. Now, to be honest with you, I'm not sure what that means, except, number one, I know they didn't eat them. Literally, they didn't eat their houses. I'm pretty sure about that. But whatever this is, it's not good. You think about that, devour widows' houses. That's a very strong indictment against them that obviously indicates their attitude wasn't right about the widowed, and they were not doing right by the widowed. In Acts chapter 6, a lot of times when we look at this passage in Acts chapter 6, we look at it from the standpoint of leadership and appointing leadership and how important it is to appoint good people to provide the necessary sorts of ministries. Well, now remember at Acts chapter 6, if you started at chapter 1, you see the exciting story, the thrilling story of a thriving church, and the gospel's being preached and people are becoming Christians. And we read about thousands of people, and we read about people being added to the church and the number of disciples being multiplied. And then you see the sin, the terrible sin and the setback, the dramatic setback in chapter 5 with the greed and the covetousness, and it really shook the foundations of the church. And then in chapter 6, the first ministry weakness identified in inspired scripture in the first century church. And of all of the ministry weaknesses that they would have had with a group of thousands of people, the one that's mentioned in scripture is one that has to do with neglect in regard to the widowed. That verse 1 there of chapter 6. Now, in those days, when the number of the disciples was multiplying, there arose a complaint against the Hebrews by the Hellenists because their widows were neglected in the daily distribution. You had these Jews who were what they would have conceived of as real Jews, and then you had the fake Jews who were born outside of Palestine, and they were more Greek cultured. And so you had this tension between the purebreds and the ones not so purebred, is I think a blunt way to put it. And you have some widows that are being neglected in the daily ministration. Now, if you were to have thousands of people together, one of the things that you have is you have problems. You probably have had enough experience with people to know that. As a matter of fact, when I'm by myself, do you know what I have? Is I have problems because I'm a flawed person and I have issues. I have problems. Well, when two people get married, what do they have? Well, they have a marriage, and hopefully it's going to be a great marriage, but they also have problems because they're adding their problems. The two have become one, and now they brought their individual problems together. Imagine when you had thousands of people together. Imagine, do you really think that this was the only ministry weakness in the first century church? When they had thousands of people at this point in Jerusalem? But yet this is the one that's recorded in Scripture, the neglect of the widows. But it's consistent with the care and compassion that God has obviously displayed when you read the Old Testament, his concern for the people who are less fortunate. In the New Testament, there is the passage in James 1 and verse 27. That is a very familiar passage, and we'll finish with that in this session. In James chapter 1, I'd like for you to do something that old brother Charles Hodge used to encourage. Old brother Charles Hodge in Texas, he would say, familiar scriptures ought to be read more carefully. I think that's a good thought. James 1 and verse 27, pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this. Now think of all the things that he could have mentioned. You think of all the things that he could have mentioned that are descriptive of or are indications of pure and undefiled religion. He mentions to visit the orphans and widows in their trouble and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. That word visit is a translation this word I have up here on the screen, common verb to see, to inspect. It's in the present tense in this particular passage, which has to do with linear action. It has to do with continual action, typically. It has to do with the habit of doing something. It has to do with the practice of doing something. It's about looking over and inspecting a situation, and then in light of that, addressing the needs. That's what the word visit is. In the Bible, that word in our English Bibles, that's what it is. It's the idea not just of making a social call, it's about looking over and inspecting a situation and then addressing it to the best of your ability. Well, in James 1:27, this description of pure and undefiled religion, it says that we need to be, among other things, visiting the widowed. Now, for years, for decades in the Lord's church, we've been, I think, deeply committed to children's ministries. There are children's homes all over the place that we've cooperated together as individual Christians and as churches. You know, there's Schultz Lewis over in Indiana. There's Midwestern down north of Cincinnati. There's Potter Children's Home in Bowling Green, Kentucky. There's Tennessee Children's Home in West Tennessee, Middle Tennessee, and East Tennessee. We have children's homes all over the place because we know that we need to compassionately minister to children who are at-risk kids. Now, for decades, we've been doing that. In the same passage, it says that we ought to be ministering to the widowed. Have we really been doing that? We don't have time to look at this passage. Maybe we'll quickly look at it in the next section. But obviously, I hope that you see at this point that deep within the heart of God, there is a concern for those who have lost their marital mates. And God wants to see to it that those folks are cared for. Some need more care than others. But it is an area of ministry that it seems to me like, now again, I'm more ignorant than I am knowledgeable about anything, but it seems to me that we could be doing a lot better job than what we're doing in regard to ministering to the widowed, because that's close to the heart of God. It's a part of pure and undefiled religion before God. So I'd like to encourage us to do more of that. Thanks very much for your time. Let's take a break.